America had mastered industry, but could it dominate the world? While factories drove the economy and steel constructed cities, the country stood at a turning point. Wealth was increasing, but so were fractures. Innovation thrived, yet volatility lurked beneath. While the U.S. concentrated on expansion domestically, a tempest brewed internationally, soon to challenge America's fortitude like never before. Wars swept across Europe, and although the U.S. was neutral, for how long could it remain on the sidelines? When the call to fight came, would America respond? And if so, would it come out stronger or forever altered? At the turn of the 20th century, America was a giant in the making, but one that was hesitant to take its first step onto the world stage. When World War I broke out in 1914, Europe was in turmoil, but on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was far away, both geographically and politically. President Woodrow Wilson was adamant that it should remain so. He felt that America's mission was not in war, but in peace, and his policy of neutrality was an expression of that vision. But could the U.S. remain aloof from a war that promised to remake the world? Wilson's neutrality was not idealistic. It was pragmatic. The war in Europe had provided a special economic opportunity. American businesses prospered as they supplied food, munitions, and materials to belligerent nations, especially Britain and France. Avoiding the conflict meant benefiting from it. The prosperous economy made many Americans cautious about getting involved. Why endanger young lives when the nation could reap the rewards from the sidelines? Neutrality was simpler in theory than reality. American public opinion was sharply divided. Most regarded the war as a European conflict, not theirs to fix. Millions of immigrants had connections to the warring nations. Some sympathized with Germany, while others with the Allies. America was a melting pot of allegiance, and entering the war could shatter that delicate cohesion. Papers argued indefinitely. Should America protect democracy overseas, or should it concentrate on its development? The atrocities of trench warfare, gas attacks, large-scale casualties were well publicized, further confirming the public's aversion to participation. But neutrality grew more and more impossible. Germany's unlimited submarine warfare aimed at American vessels strained the patience of a nation seeking to remain at peace. When the notorious Zimmermann telegram disclosed Germany's plot to induce Mexico to war against the U.S., the fantasy of remaining out broke. Wilson had assured that America would remain out of war, but things were dragging the country into a different future. The times were changing, and before long, America could no longer stay behind. It was not even a question of whether it would enter the war, but how joining it would recast its future. While World War I ravaged Europe, the United States was slow to act, refusing to be pulled into a war that had already taken millions of lives. However, neutrality was a thin line, and no matter how hard America tried, the world would not allow it to remain on the sidelines. Three critical instances would drive the U.S. beyond its limits, transforming it from a bystander to a full participant in one of history's bloodiest conflicts. Relations between Germany and the United States had been strained for years, primarily as a result of Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. The North Atlantic was a war zone traversed by German U-boats that considered any ship, naval or civilian, a possible target. The British luxury liner, Lusitania, was one of the most notorious casualties of this policy. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the ship, and it sank to the ocean floor in 18 minutes. Almost 1,200 were killed, including 128 Americans. The sinking outraged the nation, but President Woodrow Wilson remained steadfast in his policy of neutrality. Germany, realizing the increasing belligerence, retreated for the moment, promising to limit its submarine raids. But this truce would prove short-lived. Germany was desperate by early 1917. The war had lasted much longer than anyone could have anticipated, and its masters realized that unlimited submarine warfare represented their only hope of destroying Britain before U.S. entry was unavoidable. They bet they could disrupt British supply lines and win the war before America was able to mobilize. In January, Germany declared it would reinstate unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing that it could very well lead to the U.S. being provoked. This was the initial crack in Wilson's resolve. Then the coup de grace, the Zimmermann telegram. In February 1917, British intelligence intercepted a coded message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. The offer was provocative. Germany would assist Mexico in regaining Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it were to enter the war against the U.S. When the British presented the telegram to Wilson, it was made public, setting off a blaze of indignation. The possibility of a foreign nation plotting against the U.S. was not something that could be dismissed. By April, Wilson had exhausted all the reasons he had for remaining outside the war. In a fiery speech to Congress, he announced that the world must be made safe for democracy. It was no longer merely a matter of national security, it was a matter of ideology, of America's duty to determine the future. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. What ensued was a revolution. America, previously reluctant to act, would now take its place on the world stage as a force to be feared. But war was not cheap, one that would push the nation's mettle, cohesion, and values to the limit. Would America be the world's new leader, or would the atrocities of war leave wounds too deep to mend? When America entered World War I in April 1917, the war had already been burning for 3 years. Millions were dead, whole cities were destroyed, and Europe was on its knees. The coming of American soldiers would turn the situation around, but would they be able to do it in time? The Allies, Britain, France, and Italy, were worn down at the time of the U.S. entry. The war was now a cruel stalemate, with both forces engaged in trench warfare that consumed lives without capturing much territory. Germany, although suffering from blockades and starvation, remained a force to be reckoned with. They had made a desperate gamble, unlimited submarine warfare, and a bid to keep America neutral through espionage and diplomatic intrigue. When both efforts failed, the German high command knew they had little time before fresh U.S. forces tipped the balance. The American forces, though, were not ready for a war of this magnitude. The U.S. Army had fewer than 200,000 soldiers, as opposed to the millions in Europe. But with General John J. Pershing at the helm, the country mobilized with incredible rapidity. More than 1 million American troops, doughboys they were called, had arrived in France by mid-1918. Their effect was felt right away. Unlike tired European units, American troops were fresh and brimming with vitality, their morale not yet weakened by long years of war of attrition. The already stretched German units found themselves at war with a force they couldn't outwear. American troops contributed significantly to the pivotal fights of the Second Battle of the Marne and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The latter, which began in September 1918, was the biggest battle in American history up to that point. More than 1.2 million Americans were involved in it, assisting in repelling German troops and shattering their final major defensive line. The war wasn't only fought and won on the battlefield. America's economic and industrial strength was equally pivotal. The U.S. supplied weapons, food, and money to the Allies, keeping their war efforts afloat when resources were dwindling. Britain and France were in debt, but America was wealthy enough to bankroll the fight, and this economic strength would determine the post-war world. By November 1918, Germany was in full retreat. Its leaders, perceiving no hope of victory, signed an armistice on November 11. The Great War was finished, but the price had been enormous. More than 116,000 American troops died, and the world was left to deal with the devastation. The question was no longer merely how America had contributed to the ending of the war, but what type of world it would assist in building in its wake. With the war behind it, America was at a crossroads. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 tried to reorganize the world, blaming Germany and trying to keep conflicts from arising in the future. President Woodrow Wilson dreamed of a new time of diplomacy using the League of Nations, an international organization, to keep the peace. But because of his endeavors, the U.S. Senate spurned the League and opted for isolation rather than global leadership. But America's economic power was impossible to overlook. As Europe fought to rebuild, the U.S. had come out richer than ever before. The war had made it the world's greatest industrial and financial power. American banks now controlled much of Europe's debt, and U.S. corporations grew globally. The 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, turned into a decade of prosperity and change in terms of economic development and culture. The cities prospered, the industries bloomed, and new technologies such as the automobile and the radio reshaped daily life. American culture dominated the globe, ranging from jazz music to Hollywood movies, and cemented the nation's status beyond its shores. But under the prosperity, tensions brewed. The war had transformed society, upsetting traditional norms and widening class divisions. Some welcomed modernity, while others dreaded it. The question was, could America sustain its new power, or would domestic strife and international uncertainty undermine its ascension? The world was changing rapidly, and the country had to choose whether to accept its position as a leader or withdraw again into isolation. America had reached record levels, its economy booming, and its reach spanning the world. The Roaring Twenties brought an age of prosperity, innovation, and cultural upheaval. But prosperity is a trickster. Behind the shiny veneer, cracks were beginning to appear. Reckless investments, growing inequality, and an unregulated financial system laid the groundwork for catastrophe. As the country celebrated its triumph, few noticed the storm brewing. The stock market, once a beacon of limitless possibility, was about to become the engine of America's most devastating financial disaster. When the crash did arrive, it would not only erase fortunes, it would shake the very foundation of the American dream. How did one moment on Wall Street shock the world? And could America rebound before everything collapsed? The future of the country was in the balance, and its survival would rest on bold leadership, toughness, and a vision for a new America.